As you know, over summer, the media went, well, troppo. Basically, there was no pushback and you got a little insight into what the lefty utopia would be when it comes to information, where, as we know, it was all about two narratives. One, the bloke who was re-elected by the Prime Minister by the country was a mistake in the Prime Minister, and two is that Australia must join the Greens utopia ASAP to make sure that bushfires never happen again. As if somehow, if Labor or the Greens had won in May, somehow the bushfires wouldn't have happened across summer. Now, tomorrow night on the show, I'm going to get into some detail about hazard reduction, because the Prime Minister, quite correctly in his conversation with Peter Credlin earlier tonight, said that basically in the same way that we have the Close the Gap report, we should have an annual tally. What have we done to make sure that bushfires won't be as bad next summer compared to this summer? Now, for some, climate change and climate change action is all that that's about. But the truth is that, remember, the Paris Agreement is 2030. That's 10 years away. The next fire could be less than 10 hours away, let alone 10 weeks, let alone 10 months. So hazard reduction matters, making sure that we have a professional fire service that works effortlessly with the volunteer service, and that the volunteer service is not too caught up in its own bureaucracy at HQ. Now, I have to say this because people will deliberately misinterpret what I've just said, and I believe it with everything I've got. I offer no criticism of the RFS, both at the local or at the official level, but the truth is that there is a failure somewhere in the system. We hear today about people who were at the Mogo Zoo. You may remember when they were being evacuated at the height of the fires. Apparently they couldn't get a fire truck anywhere near the joint. Remember, in the Southern Highlands, there were people who are locals who tried to defend their community in case of bushfire, but they were told to go and fight somewhere else. So when the fire started to come towards them, they weren't even able to get back in. We have to have conversations about whether you can have one road in and one road out. That was a big finding that came out of the Black Saturday fires. These are all of the things that need to be said. None of this is climate denialism. But I wanted to show you about just how a certain few words help shape the summer, and how it was done, particularly via the media. We had a look and we tallied up, thanks to a media monitoring firm, about some key words that you heard an awful lot of over summer. Let's have a look at some of those words, all right? Unprecedented, disaster, horrific, devastation, catastrophic, and climate change. Across all forms of the media and social media, we were able to work out how many times those words were used in the Australian media alone from November last year until just last week. Here's how it breaks down. On broadcast, that being radio or television, disaster was second to climate change, 163,000 references. But look at that word unprecedented. Look at horrific. Look at devastation. All of these words that are there, not just to tell you what's going on, but to try to build the narrative about how bad what is going on. Now, no one doesn't think that it wasn't a terrible fire season. But as you know, there's not just television and radio. What about newspapers? Newspapers also have their online versions. Well, it's a similar story there, where the number one thing that they talked about was climate change, the number two was disaster, and then unprecedented was double devastation, and catastrophic was also at over 50,000 total mentions, as you can see. 627, 320,000. But have a look at social media. Because when you look at social media, climate change was mentioned 644,000 times. The next and nearest was about 400,000 behind, and that is the word disaster. Unprecedented, horrific, and devastation barely got a look in. But this gives you an idea about how, when the media was using Twitter as a weather vane of social media opinion and public opinion, that unsurprisingly they thought that Australia was ready for a climate change revolution. But the truth about social media, particularly when it comes to Twitter, is that in a country of 25 million people, just over 3 million are actually on Twitter. Twitter might be real people, but it ain't real life. Quiet Australians are not on Twitter. Yes, a lot are on Facebook, and a lot of people had plenty to say about the fires. But I show you all of this just to show you that if you felt that you heard certain words over and over and over again, you're absolutely right. In fact, if you look overall at the totals of all of the words that we used, here's what happened. Unprecedented was used in all forms of media 184,000 times. Disaster, 374,000 times. Climate change, 890,000 1,000 times. Why? Not necessarily because the TV was talking about it, not necessarily because the websites were talking about it, not necessarily because the radio was talking about it, not necessarily because it was there in your newspaper, but definitely because of what the lefties were talking about on social media. Twitter is not real life. It dragged the debate disproportionately at a time of emergency to what people demand when it comes to politics. That, of course, has been where much of the debate, so-called debate, has been. But as I've shown you over the past couple of nights, the lefties don't like that normal people are pushing back. That normal people, through programs like ours and Talkback Radio, are now able to start to say, OK, is everyone OK? All right, let's talk about the garbage that was fed to us by the hard left and the activist media. Now, of course, for those who live in $1.9 million houses in Canberra that have no chance of being burnt down in any fire season, let alone the one that, of course, took out Canberra with a couple of hundred homes in just one day, their jobs are not going to be affected by drastic action on climate change because they work for websites which, of course, get paid the more they talk about climate change. It is in their business model to keep talking about it. It is in other media organisations' business models, including the taxpayer-funded ones, to talk about the issues that they want to talk about. And they're all on Twitter. So they say, everyone is talking about it. Everyone wasn't. But you know that because you're normal.